So for the topic of this video, we're going to talk about the philosophers who characterized the later Enlightenment period and follow maybe some of the pathways of thought that they pursued during this time. We will begin with a philosopher by the name of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. I think I got that in the right order, maybe not. But anyway, we'll just call him Hegel. And Hegel is an interesting guy. He comes into the scene basically in response to Immanuel Kant. Of course, what we're going to see is that a great number of these philosophers that we will talk about during the later Enlightenment period and on into the modern era really represent a sort of way of trying to deal with what Immanuel Kant had said. Some of them will be in favor of it. And what I mean by that is that they will be in favor of reaching above the line of despair, if you will. And they'll try to do that one way or another. They'll try to propose various ways of doing that. Others will forsake the whole notion that it's even possible to reach above the line of despair, and they will stay below that line, and they will try to see how we can make a meaningful life in the world now, the phenomenal world. They may not use that same terminology, but that basically is what they're getting at. Well, Hegel is one of those philosophers who believed that we could possibly get above the line. He's one of the more optimistic philosophers in response to Immanuel Kant. He believed that even though we may live in the phenomenal world, yet there still is a way that we can utilize reason, that we can utilize a process in order to get above that line so that we can experience things like we can find true meaning, we can find ultimate reality, we can, in Hegel's own words, we can know the mind of God. Although his understanding of God is probably a little bit different than what the typical Western understanding would mean, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But to introduce Hegel, the years for Hegel are 1770 through 1831, and Hegel was one who agreed with Kant on a fundamental level. However, he disagreed with Kant's conclusion, whereas Kant said that we are completely cut off from the upper story, that we can only know the world as we experience it, let alone the world as it is, not the world as it is in itself. Hegel believed that we could rise above that line of despair. He was more optimistic that we could do that. We could find meaning and purpose and morals. We could find value and so forth above that line of despair. He believed that knowledge of God's mind is possible. And God's mind for Hegel is not the idea that we can somehow pray to God, that God is this supernatural being that has a personality, if you will, such that we can know what God's personality is like. For Hegel, God is more of a concept, although I think that he would probably disagree with that in that assessment. For Hegel, God is all things. God is a world spirit. Hegel is what you might know as or characterize as a panentheist. Now, we've seen pantheism somewhat. Pantheism is the idea that all things in their totality are God. So that all things are one, and then in the totality of all things, that is God. So you and I are different parts of God, not even necessarily parts, but the parts themselves are illusions of disconnectedness, illusions of separation. In reality, we're all part of the fundamental, ultimate reality, which is God. Now, Hegel did not believe that. He believed rather in a sort of world spirit that is God, who on the one hand is above or outside of creation, and yet on the other hand represents a unity with it, such that not a complete unity, but a unity with it, such that God can change the world and the world can change God, and the two will act as forces on one another in order to alter one another. So God is in process of changing, whereas we are also. So he's a panentheist. Panentheism means everything is in God. It's almost the idea that God is pregnant with all of creation, and as creation changes God, God also works on and affects creation. But we can know God's mind. And so you see this, the distinction that Hegel makes between God and the world, and that's kind of akin or similar to the distinction that Kant makes between the noumenal world and the phenomenal realm. Whereas Kant says we can't get above that line, Hegel is optimistic that we can. So that's Hegel. Now, how do we get above that line? Well, for Hegel, and this is a very sort of abstract process in his philosophy, but Hegel, and this is what he's best known for, and honestly, this is of his ideas what has impacted us most after the Enlightenment period. For Hegel, we can reach the mind of God through what he calls the dialectic. The dialectic. To understand this, it might be better, it's actually easier if you draw it out on a chart or something of that nature. And so I encourage you to make sure to download the accompanying PowerPoint presentation where you can see it's kind of configured out there. But for Hegel, truth does not consist in a thesis. Okay. Now, if you remember what is a thesis? Well, a thesis is a statement of one's position. Like if you are arguing in a position paper, you're arguing a thesis. You're going to state your position clearly, and then you're going to follow that up with evidences or arguments in favor of your position and so forth. But all of those evidences and arguments are going to be related back to your thesis, giving support to that. Well, typically, if we want to make a statement of truth, what we will offer is a thesis, a statement of what we believe to be the case. And that would be, a thesis would in that sense be a truth claim or a proposition of truth. Whereas truth is offered in propositions, Hegel believes that ultimately truth is not found in your thesis. You may propose a thesis as a statement of truth, but truth is not found there ultimately. And here's why. Because for Hegel, every time a person makes a thesis or a proposition of truth, that thesis is going to spawn what he calls an antithesis. In other words, the antithesis is the anti of your thesis. Now, when we talk about thesis and antithesis, they represent possibly two statements of truth. So for the thesis, for example, God exists, the antithesis of that is God does not exist. God exists versus God does not exist. Those would be seemingly contradictory statements. And usually we look for and argue for truth in these kinds of contradictory statements in debates and so forth. Well, Hegel doesn't believe that our truth can be found either in thesis or antithesis, but rather truth can be found in what he calls the synthesis. It's sort of a middle road between the two. And you might say, well, wait a second, hold on, that doesn't make any sense. If you take the categorical statement that God exists as your thesis, which spawns the antithesis that God does not exist, those are contradictory statements. They're mutually exclusive. You cannot put them together and create a synthesis. But Hegel would disagree. He would say, instead of saying God exists or God does not exist, a better way of looking at it is that God is becoming. In other words, God is, he in some sense exists now, but not in the sense of finality that ultimately God will ultimately exist. And so God God neither is nor is not, God is becoming. And so this is where he gets his idea that God is changing or can be changed by the world around him. Thesis, antithesis brings together to form a synthesis. Now, the reason for this, Hegel would say, is because if you are arguing either this or that, either thesis or antithesis, basically your world is not big enough to encompass both realities or both propositions of truth. And since we can conceive of these things, these propositions, we have to conceive of a world that is able to encompass both of them and accommodate both of them. Well, how do you do that? Well, you bring them together to realize their synthesis, that there is truth in both statements. God is, he exists in the sense that there is a being known as God, but God does not exist in the sense that that God is finished and that he is existing in this current state and never will change. So God is always changing. So God is, instead of being or not being, God is becoming. And anyway, so that's basically Hegel's understanding of the world and his justification for it. Now, one of the difficulties with this, though, is this. When you have a thesis that combines with your antithesis to form a synthesis, ultimately that synthesis itself becomes a statement or a proposition of truth. In other words, that synthesis becomes a thesis, which spawns its own antithesis, which comes together to form another synthesis, which then is the synthesis automatically, because it's a proposition of truth, becomes a thesis. And so perhaps you can see the sort of ad infinitum, where we can have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and so on. You can see where this is going to lead to a proliferation of theses. Theses, I don't know which one of those is correct, but a proliferation of those to the extent that you have an infinite amount of possibilities, because you can always spawn another antithesis, create a synthesis, which then is the thesis, and so on. And to his credit, Hegel wrote volumes of this sort of idea, the volumes of trying to put together a thesis and an antithesis together with a synthesis and so forth. For example, he would talk about the history of philosophy, that the thesis started out with Parmenides. And if you remember back when we looked at the pre-Socratic philosophers, that Parmenides was the one who said that things don't change. And so you've got Parmenides and Heraclitus, who says that everything is always changing. And then you get a synthesis together with those, and then you get Plato. Well, Plato is now the thesis, spawns his own antithesis, who is Aristotle, who disagrees with him. Put those together, bring those together, and you get Plotinus. You put him together with Augustine, and you get Aquinas, and so on and so on and so on. Just sort of a history of philosophical ideas sort of bouncing off one another, if you will. This is a process that Hegel noted throughout history. His theory is often called dialectical idealism, and whereas Kant asserts sort of the difference between the noumenal and phenomenal, again, Hegel believed that even though there may be a difference between them, you can get to the upper story. You can, through the dialectic, reach into the upper story, up into the very mind of God, he would say, or the world's spirit, he would call it. But that's Hegel's basic idea, the dialectic. It was known as dialectical idealism because, again, he's trying to reach for that which is not material. He's trying to reach and grasp in order to justify the existence of something higher than the material world, whether it's the mind of God, the Geist, as he calls it, the spirit, the world spirit, just the mind, purpose, meaning, values, this sort of thing, things that aren't tangible, but that also at the same time give life meaning. That's what he's going for. But he uses this dialectic. Well, now after him comes another philosopher, sort of tracing this development of ideas. And whereas Hegel believed in dialectical idealism, trying to get to the non-material aspect of the world of reality, of our human experience, the next guy that comes along is a guy by the name of Karl Marx. In his philosophy is known as dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism. He takes from Hegel. He takes the idea of the dialectic from Hegel and utilizes it, but Marx is one of the philosophers who does not believe that we can grasp for anything above the line of despair. He's the one who does not believe that we can reach for anything higher, because that which is higher doesn't exist. It's meaningless to even talk about this sort of thing. We need to just worry about the world as we experience it, the world down here on earth as it is, the material world. And so he's going to take the dialectic, and instead of trying to hop above the line of despair, he's going to stay below it, and he's going to see how to live life within this realm. Well, Karl Marx's dialectical materialism basically starts out with the basic assumption that history is a dialectical process. It's a process of dialectical class struggle between those who have and those who don't have, the haves and the have-nots. And he chronicles some of these things. He walks through a sort of a historical sketch. And he'll talk about, for example, slavery. In the dialectic that you have, the thesis, antithesis, you've got the slave master as the thesis, the slave as the antithesis. And so those two form either side of the dialectic, the thesis or antithesis. During the feudal period, you've got the noble and the serf, which again is the haves and the have-nots, the thesis, the antithesis. When you look at a capitalist society, for Karl Marx, you've got the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Again, the thesis and antithesis. And we're not going to go through a complete look at Marx's philosophy right now. But there are some things that I'd like to point out about it. So anyway, the last one that we talked about, a capitalist society, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Let's explain those terms briefly for a moment. Karl Marx, he coins these two terms, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, to refer to the thesis and antithesis of class struggle. The bourgeoisie, Marx says, are the members of a capitalist society who own the means of production in that society. And if you kind of think about it, what are the means of production? Well, the means of production are any business, any corporation, any farm, any kind of manufacturing plant, things like this that produce goods. Okay, it could be an oil refinery, it could be just any number of things, a car manufacturing plant, a shoemaking plant, whatever the case may be. Any concern, any business, any effort to produce goods that others can consume, that is a means of production. And only certain members of a capitalist society, Marx says, own these means of production. And the people who own these means of production, Marx refers to them as the bourgeoisie. Those are the bourgeoisie. Now, they are the thesis. And the antithesis of the bourgeoisie are those members of a capitalist society who do not own the means of production. Now, it's easy to see if you own means of production, some kind of means of production, then you have a capital by which you can engage in trade. So if you produce a good that other people want, that is in demand, then you have the ability to take that which you produce and capitalize on it and trade for what you want. So if I produce car tires, and I need I need food because I can't exactly eat car tires. Well, I can go around to all the farmers who are producing the food who do need tires for their trucks and their cars and their tractors and things like that. And I can say, hey, look, I've got these tires here. I can't eat my tires. And if you have tires for your vehicles, you can produce a whole lot more. So why don't we engage in some trade? And so if I own the means of production and someone else owns the means of production, then we can engage in trade so that we can make sure that we have the means to live our lives. Well, that's easy for the bourgeoisie because they own the means of production. They can engage in that kind of trade. But there's another class of people that Marx refers to, and those are the proletariat. The proletariat are the people who do not own the means of production in society, and so they cannot engage in trade. So how are they going to live their life? And how are they going to be able to survive in such a society where it's very possible that you'll starve to death if you do not own any sort of means of production, if you don't have any goods to trade? Well, the way that the proletariat earns their living is that the proletariat are wage earners. These are people who sell their labor so that they can make money, and then they can engage in trade as well. So that would be the proletariat. The proletariat are wage earners. They're people who do not own the means of production. They don't have that, and so they have to be paid per hour or however they're paid. Whereas the bourgeoisie are the people who own the means of production, right? So that's those are the two classes. Now, what Marx says is what Marx points out next is he says, look, the system as a class struggle here, the reason it's a class struggle is this, is that the bourgeoisie, how do they make their money? Well, they make their money, actually, and they produce their goods off of the stolen labor of the proletariat. Now, here's what he's saying. If, for example, let's imagine this situation. Let's say that a certain business owner or a certain bourgeoisie person who owns a means of production is producing his good, and he needs people to come and help work on it, right? Because if he wants to grow and expand and produce more, he's going to have help. And so he goes out and he hires people to help him in his manufacturing concern. But how does he make money then? Well, here's how it happens. When he goes to the proletariat that he's hiring to help him produce his goods so that he can grow and expand his business, let's say, for example, that proletariat person, let's say that they produce the equivalent of $20 per hour in production. Whatever it is that they're producing, whatever widget it is that they're producing, they produce $20 an hour, or the equivalent of $20 an hour to produce this thing. Well, the way that the bourgeoisie makes money is that the bourgeoisie takes the production from the proletariat worker that he has hired, and he does not pay the proletariat the full amount that the proletariat produces. So if the proletariat produces $20 an hour, the bourgeoisie decides, you know what, I will pay this person $12 an hour, and then I will keep the extra $8 an hour and either reinvest it in the business, or pay the relevant taxes or benefits, or maybe spend it on my new yacht or vacation, whatever the case may be. I'm going to take the extra $8 an hour and use that as my profit. And Marx sees this and he says, look, see, the problem is the bourgeoisie is stealing money off of the labor of the proletariat. And that situation Karl Marx considers to be absolutely immoral. That is immoral. So that's why he frowns upon capitalism, and that among other things is what evokes this sort of class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, because the proletariat knows what's being done to him. He knows that he should be making more money than this. I mean, let's face it. He's producing, let's say he's producing shoes, and he's producing X amount of shoes, let's say 10 pair of shoes an hour. He's producing that. And he's getting paid, let's say, $20 an hour, which is a pretty high wage. But then when he goes out there and he sees that how much these shoes sell for, then he realizes that the markup and the profit that is being made here, he realizes that he's not being paid nearly what he is producing for this for this manufacturing concern. So he begins to sort of develop this antipathy toward or this hatred, this despising of his boss. Now, another thing that happens in a capitalist society, and Marx says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but ultimately this system is going to undermine itself. This system is going to collapse, as it were, and this is what's going to happen. He believes that what will eventually happen is that because of the kind of competition that is present within people who produce the same kinds of goods, eventually this dog-eat-dog sort of competition is going to make some people produce either better or more or cheaper, higher quality product, and eventually they're going to start buying out all their competitors. They're going to run their competitors into bankruptcy, and they're going to start buying them out. We see this sort of thing happen with cars, right? I mean, how many automobile companies fit under the heading of GM Motors, right? You've got Chevy, you've got Saturn, you've got Cadillac, Oldsmobile. Used to be Pontiac. I don't think they make those anymore, but there are all these different car companies that maybe started out on their own, but then eventually were bought up by General Motors and basically forced out of business that way. And so eventually, Marx says, it's going to get to the point where the bourgeoisie is going to eat itself. Because what happens to those people, let's say we've got two competitors and they're both fighting, they're going at each other, and then all of a sudden one of them gets the upper hand and forces the other one out of business. What happens to all of those people? Well, one of two things happen, right? Either they go bankrupt and they're unemployed, which Marx does talk about the armies of unemployed under capitalism, or they go to work for the person that forced them into bankruptcy, in which case they become proletariat themselves. So the bourgeoisie eventually is going to, through this market competition, is going to reduce itself to a what is known as a monopoly, and so it will be a monopoly. There will be very, very few at the top. There'll be a whole bunch of people at the bottom, and that's going to lead to an unsustainable situation. And that's where Marx believes quite naturally the capitalist system is going to undermine itself. The thesis of bourgeoisie, the antithesis of proletariat, are going to come together and form a synthesis. And that synthesis is going to be the communist situation. Now, so you've got bourgeoisie, proletariat, you bring those two together and you reach communism. Now, Marx believes that this will happen quite naturally, but that's not what he wants to do. He believes that the time is now for this communist revolution. And so Marx details and chronicles different ways or different things, and this is a fascinating study that if you ever take ethics class, at least in my class, we go through distribution of wealth or just distribution of wealth, and communism is one of the ideas that tries to get at that, right? So we talk in depth about it. But he believes that there are 10 different phases, 10 different things that a nation can implement on its way to becoming a communist nation. And he believes that they should do that. But communism in and of itself, Karl Marx, I keep going to call him Kant, but Marx would say basically goes through 5 different stages. And this is an interesting sort of phase here. The first phase that we enter into, and that's where everybody is at in a capitalist society, is that of class struggle. And Marx believes that class struggle is the first phase of communism, of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where bourgeoisie, proletariat are fighting each other and they're going to meld into one. The second stage he would propose is that of revolution. And what happens during a revolution, a communist revolution? Well, according to Marx, what needs to happen is that the proletariat needs to rise up in revolution and seize the property from the bourgeoisie, so that the proletariat then has property. Now, you remember how we defined those two classes, right? The bourgeoisie were the ones who had the means of production. The proletariat were the ones who did not have the means of production. If the proletariat seizes the means of production from the bourgeoisie, then what does that do to the bourgeoisie? Well, it makes them in the same place as the proletariat. And if they seize that property, the proletariat are no longer the proletariat because they have the means of production now. And so the bourgeoisie, the proletariat come together in revolution and they become a classless society. In other words, there's no class in this society. We're not talking about manners, right? What we're talking about is that there's not the class of bourgeoisie and the class of proletariat. Well, how do we do that? How do we transition through that? Well, Marx says that what we need to do then on phase number 3, so you've got class struggle, revolution. Phase 3 is we need to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat is basically what you see in any communist nation right now. In their different phases or different versions of it. Some of them are more Marxian, some of them follow other communist philosophers. But the basic idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat is that we need to be educated and we need to be conditioned to move away from a capitalist society. This is what Marx is saying. And in order to do that, we have to have certain people, leaders and educators, that will help educate us, or maybe re-educate us, into accepting the tenets of communism and understanding how to apply them to society as a whole. Now, I would say this, and I know that some people might give me some pushback on this, but there's never been an effort at communism that has gone past this stage of communism. Every one of them have gotten to this point and stalled out. And I think, what was it, just a couple of years ago, we celebrated, quote unquote, it was the 100th year of communism in the Western world. In that 100 years, no communist state has made it past this dictatorship of the proletariat. It always stalls at the dictatorship level, where we have a dictator that's ruling over, the various communist places. Well, there's probably some good reason for that, and a lot of it has to do probably with Karl Marx's idea, and this is a basic socialist ideal. The idea that we should, that everybody should work for a common good, for the common good of all people. The problem with that is that it tends to de-incentivize production. For example, here's basically what happens. Let's say that Karl Marx says that, and this is a quote from him: "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And here's what he means by this: that we all should work according to our ability, so that we can produce goods that will then be pooled and distributed throughout society according to the need that each individual has. So I go and I work and I produce all that I can. Then that production, that amount of production, is taken and it's utilized to provide goods for everybody around me. So that's what that's how things are sort of redistributed. But imagine what that would be like on a personal level. For example, let's say that I myself and another person are doing a job. Let's say that this other person is significantly younger and stronger and healthier than I am, and so we're doing this job. We're producing this widget. And in the process of producing this widget, this other person produces twice as much as I do, because they're younger, they're more energetic, they're more quick-minded. I've got to take breaks every once in a while. I've got to, because my back hurts or whatever. They produce twice as much in a given week than I do. They have twice as many widgets. Well, at the end of the week, who's going to get paid more in a communist setting? This person, let's say that they're 18 years old, or me, I'm 47 years old, at least as of the recording of this video. Who's going to get paid more? Now, many people might be tempted to say, I would get paid more, but you don't understand the communist state, if that's what you think. Or, I'm sorry, that he would get paid more because he produced more, therefore he should get paid more. But that's the way the capitalist thinks. The capitalist thinks that you get paid according to your production. Well, that's not the communist way. The others would say, well, you get paid the same amount of money because you each get an equal distribution of wealth. And while that is moving closer to a communist ideal, it is not the communist way of thinking. Remember, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. This young man has produced twice as many widgets as I have. However, I'm married and I have 6 children at home. And so I have a lot more need than he does. So at the end of the week, we're not paid according to what we produce, we're paid according to what we need. And I need a whole lot more with a family of 8 than he does with just himself. And so we're going to come to the end of the week and we're going to be like sitting back comparing paychecks. And I'm going to be like, man, I am so thankful that I live in this place where I can get all this money. And what is he going to be thinking? Man, I worked twice as hard as that guy, and I got paid 1/8 of what he got paid. So what's he going to do next week? Do you think he's going to work as hard? No, he's probably not going to work as hard. In fact, whenever I go to sit down and take a break, he's probably going to come take a break with me, and we're going to talk. And and as we're talking, that's taking more of my time and more of his time. And so overall, our combined production is going to decrease. He's going to say, I'm not going to work so hard because I don't get paid to work so hard. I get taken care of anyway, so what's the big deal? And now if you can understand that that's what happens on an individual level, imagine what happens on the level of the entire society. Production slows. Production decreases. The economy shrinks. And shortages begin to happen. Well, now there's another aspect to this as well, though, because as he sees that I still get paid more than him, he thinks to himself, well, wait a second, what can I do to make more money? It's not work harder. That's not going to make me more money. I'm not, produce more. No, that's not going to make me more money. What's going to make me more money is if I create more need. If I create more need. And so what is he going to do? Well, he's probably going to go get married. He's probably going to have a couple children so as to bump up his paycheck. And so here's the bottom line. Marxism and communism, the reason that they have not progressed beyond the dictatorship of the proletariat is simply because they de-incentivize production. There's no incentivization of production. And so production slows. What they do incentivize, though, is the creation of need in order to prosper. And so de-incentivizing production, creating need, both of those forces work together. And what they do in a society is they eventually end up in bankruptcy. The whole civilization, the whole country, the nation will end up in bankruptcy. That's what practically has happened throughout the last 100+ years of communism as we've seen it. There's not been a case study ever where it has not eventuated in that. And so because that's the necessary trajectory of that worldview, and that's why it has not progressed beyond the dictatorship of the proletariat. But Marx theorized that if we could ever get past this dictatorship of the proletariat, we would end up in two additional phases to that. In the fourth phase is the withering away of the state. Now, this is where communism separates from fascism in terms of their ultimate goals. You see, fascism is a socialist ideal. It's a socialist ideology. Communism is a socialist ideology. They're both different species of this same thought process of socialism. The difference between them is this. At least one difference between them is this: is that fascism is socialism in a totalitarian state. It's a nationalistic approach to socialism. In other words, it's saying our country is great and we're going to establish a socialist sort of utopia in this country and we're going to maintain our national identity and so forth. Communism, though, does not want to see the state. They don't want to see this nationalistic divisions. Communism seeks to do away with the state and have the withering away of the state. And ideally speaking, although this has never occurred, ideally speaking, the communist goal is to go past or transcend the dictatorship of the proletariat and allow the state to just kind of fall away as communism spreads across the globe. Keep in mind, communism is a global ideology. It addresses things on a global level. And so it wants to spread across the globe. And once we've established this communist planet and we have re-educated everybody, then the dictatorship of the proletariat is no longer needed. And the state, just these geographical and political divisions that divide us from other people are eventually just going to wither away, and everybody's just going to get along in a communist setting. So that's Marx's next phase, the withering away of the state. And then after that, he believes that communism eventuates in what he calls a classless society. That's the fifth phase of communism, that it eventuates in a classless society. Now, if you look at the title of this PowerPoint on the syllabus, you will see that I've entitled this "Institutionalized Altruism." And that's essentially what it is. It's altruism. The communism and socialism in general are altruistic philosophies. And what that means is that they call upon people to work for the greater good. They call upon people to work for something outside of themselves. Even if something is not to their advantage or to their benefit, immediate benefit, they call upon you to sacrifice your own well-being in order to provide for the well-being of the whole, the group, the collective. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. So it's an altruistic ethic in that sense. It calls you to look outside of yourself and not worry about so much about your own concerns, to be collectivist minded. Now, another man that we'll talk about now, or actually another ideology, it's actually represented by two individuals here, and we're going to move on to, is that of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism and classical liberalism, both of these are also altruistic approaches. Well, they can be. Sometimes classical liberalism can also be very egoistic as well, which means that you are in it for your own good, your own benefit. But we'll see that as we go along. But the next two gentlemen we'll look at are both utilitarians. They espouse a utilitarian ethic. More on that in just a minute. But they believe that a person should work for a greater good outside of themselves. Now, I will say, however, that both Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the two utilitarians that we'll look at, are very much opposed to communism, or their ideology would be very much opposed to communism. Because they even though they're altruistic in that sense, they're utilitarian and so they're altruistic. Even though that is the case, they have a strong emphasis on individual liberties, which we'll talk about in just a minute. First guy we want to talk about is a gentleman named Jeremy Bentham, and Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian. He's a philosopher who excuse me, in his day, he was sort of a rock star. His dates back up a little bit from 1748 to 1832. But Jeremy Bentham is kind of a rock star philosopher in his day. And what I mean by that is that, back in the day before people had rock stars, they read philosophy, go figure. And he was a very popular guy. And he made the statement once upon a time that, hey, I'm going to write this book on ethics, and it's going to be like the ultimate book on ethics. It's going to tell us without a doubt what is going to be good and what is going to be bad, and if we follow it, we can do, we can be the best kind of people that we can be, so to speak. Well, Jeremy Bentham in his writing comes up with utilitarianism, and to say that his philosophy was a disappointment to people who read it after he published it is sort of an understatement. But utilitarianism, what is utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism is an ethic, it's an ethical position or an ethical theory that says that one should always do what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. One should always do what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, when you say that, that automatically brings up two questions, right? Number one, what counts as greatest? What do you mean by greatest? And number two, what do you mean by good? If we're talking about the greatest good, what do you mean by greatest? And what do you mean by good? Well, according to Jeremy Bentham, the good equals pleasure. You see, Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism is a hedonistic philosophy. It says that the greatest good that can be accomplished, and Bentham would say, is pleasure. He said we have two sovereign masters that goad us into doing whatever it is that we do. On the one hand, pain. On the other hand, pleasure. We are incentivized by pleasure. We are we're punished by pain. And so that's what motivates us to do whatever it is that we do. And so he's what is known as a hedonist. Now, when we talk about pleasure here, please understand that we're not just talking about pleasure in the sense of fulfilling pleasures of the flesh, if you will. Pleasure, according to Bentham, was sort of the good life. It included things like physical pleasures or fulfilling physical pleasures, but it also included things like mental pleasures as well. In addition to that, it also included abstaining from pain. And so if you were seeking pleasure to the extent that you were hurting yourself, that's not a good idea. Now, for example, I love Devil's Food chocolate cake, but if I just sat and ate Devil's Food chocolate cake 24/7, that pleasure would be offset by the amount of pain that it would bring as I incur various health complications, because that's all I've been eating. So rather than just overly indulge in the cake, have a little bit, have some pleasure, and then move on with life and have other kinds of pleasures as well. And so there's sort of a principle of moderation in this as well. Well, anyway, so he believed that pleasure was what is meant by good when he says that we should all work for the greatest good. Well, what do we mean by greatest? Well, here's where Bentham ran into some problems with his critics, because Bentham believed that when we talk about what is the greatest good, we should talk about the greatest in terms of quantity. The greatest in terms of quantity, the greatest quantity of pleasure. Well, quantity, if we're talking about quantity of pleasure, that's going to lead us to a certain kind of pleasure. I mean, there are all kinds of pleasurable things, right? Getting a massage is pleasurable. Taking a nice hot bath is pleasurable. Eating good food is pleasurable. A good intense discussion with friends, that's pleasurable. Reading a book is pleasurable. Listening to some good music is pleasurable, and so on and so on. But there are certain kinds of pleasures that tend to develop our mind more than other pleasures, which tend to only affect us physically. And there are a lot of people throughout the history of philosophy who have tried to make a distinction between those two things, a qualitative approach to pleasure. But Bentham is like, no, we can't do any of that. Because if we do that, then we can't say that the greatest good is the greatest amount of pleasure. We have to say that the greatest good is the greatest amount of a certain kind of pleasure, which introduces a whole another whole standard of by which to judge, and it kind of complicates things. So Bentham, wanting to keep it simple, says that no, it just has to do with quantity of pleasure. It doesn't matter what kind of pleasure it is, but what quantity of pleasure that you can get. And this made some of his detractors or his critics characterize his philosophy as a pig philosophy. Because a pig, if you give him some slop to eat, some mud and refuse to roll around in, he's going to be happy, and that's all he needs. And Bentham's philosophy seemed to indicate that as long as you give a person a great amount of physical pleasure, as long as you give a lot of it to them, then they're going to be fine. That's all they need, right? Well, there are a lot of people who including his protege, who disagree with him. But Bentham has stuck to his guns. He said, nope, it's the greatest amount of pleasure, the quantity of pleasure, and that's it. But then again, you have a difficulty with that. The difficulty you have with Bentham's quantity of pleasure is this. How do you measure that? How can you measure pleasure? How can you measure, in order to compare which is the greatest quantity of pleasure, what kind of tool are you going to use? You can't weigh it, right? You can't take pleasure and see how much volume it displaces. You can't take it and measure it in a measuring cup or anything like that. How do you measure pleasure, objectively speaking? Well, Bentham has you covered, right? Bentham has you covered because he creates what is known as hedonistic calculus. And hedonistic calculus does not have anything to do with math. Hedonistic calculus has to do with just with trying to put an objective standard to pleasure so that we can judge between this action and this action, which one brings about the greatest amount of pleasure, well, whatever it is, you compare them, contrast them, and whichever one it is the right thing to do. So which one is it? How do we do this? How do we justify it? How do we measure pleasure? And so his hedonistic calculus basically consists of a list of 7 traits, 7 qualities of pleasure, as it were, that we can give a number to. And then we give a number to it, and then we can add up all the numbers over here, add up all the numbers over here, and we can find out which one has the greatest quantity of pleasure. Now, those 7 attributes of pleasure that he talks about, the qualities of pleasure, are these. The first one is intensity, and he says what you need to do is consider the action and ask yourself, what is the intensity of the pleasure that is going to be expected? What is the intensity of the pleasure? And then you ask yourself, what is the duration of that pleasure? How long can you expect it to last? Because some pleasures are very intense for a very short period, while other pleasures are less intense, but they last a whole lot longer. And it may be the pleasure that is less intense, but that lasts a whole lot longer, is the one to be preferred, because at the end of the day, it's going to give you a greater amount of pleasure, right? Another one is certainty. How certain are you that the action you're going to do is going to produce the pleasure that you expect? And this is a weakness for all consequentialist ethics. Because ultimately, utilitarianism is asking you to, before you even get involved with the act, you have to decide, is this going to bring about the kind of pleasure that I anticipate? And so are you certain? because it may very well be that this doesn't produce the pleasure that you intend. After that, there's propinquity. Propinquity has to do with, now that's not a word that we use often in our language anymore, but propinquity, what this means is that how close or how soon can you expect the pleasure to occur? Is it going to be something that happens now, or is it something that you have to put off for later? That's propinquity. Fecundity is the idea of, that's another one of these words that we don't use a whole lot anymore. Usually fecundity is only used in animal husbandry, as you're talking about breeding animals and whatnot. Fecundity has to do with reproducibility. And the question here is okay, if you do this action and it creates this pleasure, is it possible that this pleasure can be reproduced later at a later time? Is it reproducible? So that would be another consideration. Another one would be purity. Is it going to be pleasurable and only pleasure, or is there going to be a mixture of pain in that as well? So is the pleasure expected to be pure, or is it going to be adulterated with some kind of pain? And then finally, the last characteristic that is at question here is that of extent. How many people can we expect to receive pleasure from this action, or can we expect to receive pain from this action? So that's Bentham's round idea or basic idea of hedonistic calculus, and he believed that if we evaluate certain actions according to this hedonistic calculus, we can see clearly then what would be the right thing to do. So that's Bentham. Well, Bentham, as I said, was a rock star, right? He had quite a bit of following. And utilitarianism or ethics is not the only thing that he ever wrote on. One of the other things that he was considered some sort of an expert on was educational philosophy. He had a lot of new ideas on how to educate someone, and so he had these educational ideas, and he sought to put them to use or put them to a test. And so what he did was he looked for someone who would be a bright or smart pupil that he could take and apply these educational philosophies to see how they turned out. And one of his followers said, hey, here, I have a son. He's a really bright kid. Why don't you go ahead and take my son and teach him, employ your educational philosophy on him, teach him, and then we'll see how he turns out, basically. So here's my son, experiment, right? So that's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, that's what ends up happening. And the protege of Jeremy Bentham is a guy by the name of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is he is a brilliant young man. Incredibly brilliant young man. The years on John Stuart Mill are 1806 to 1873. And he eventually writes wide and ranges wide in his writings on the topic of utilitarianism. Brilliant guy, very, very intelligent, but he has a few quirks. In fact, he excels under the tutelage of Jeremy Bentham. However, in his later teen years, he has this mental breakdown where because he has been learning so much, I mean, the guy knew 6 or 7 languages, research languages by the time he was 15, this sort of thing. He has been learning so much, he has this total emotional breakdown, but then he recovers and he begins to write, and he writes prolifically and has a lot of really interesting and good ideas. He makes a name for himself because of his writings. He writes on not only utilitarianism, that's where his main focus is, but also on classical, what's known as classical liberalism, basically pioneering some of the philosophy that sought to justify taking the power of authority away from the kings, right? And this kind of thing. So that's what he was writing on, justifying a state wherein people, even of a pluralistic sort of background, different religions, different philosophies can come together and get along. So anyway, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill is writing on all these things, and here's his take on utilitarianism. He agrees with the most part with his teacher, Jeremy Bentham. he agrees that good equals pleasure, and he does agree that that there are different kinds of pleasure, and that pleasure should be defined as the good life, not just as fulfilling one's personal physical pleasures. In fact, he takes it a step further. In fact, Mill, instead of saying that greater equals the greatest quantity of pleasure, when the principle of utility talks about the greatest good for the greatest number, he believes that greater there refers to the greatest quality of pleasure. So the most amount of the greatest quality of pleasure. So he's going to make this qualitative distinction between pleasures, these higher pleasures and these lower pleasures. And for Mill, he believed that higher pleasures correspond with mental pleasures, those things that bring mental stimulation, pleasurable mental stimulation to you. That could be reading a book, it could be going to the opera, it could be investigating some sort of scientific theory, developing mathematics, something like that, something that expands your mind and engages you intellectually. These are higher pleasures. And he kind of justifies this based on Aristotle, right? Aristotle says that if we're going to achieve happiness, remember this? Aristotle says if we're going to achieve happiness, we have to do it in a way that is consistent with our nature. And Mill seems to say, yeah, we can't just enjoy physical pleasures, because we have, as human beings, have been given this mental ability as well. So we need to develop that. And so he agrees we need to develop our mental capacity, our intellectual pleasures. But he does agree that there are also there's a case to be made for physical pleasures as well. That we're not just mental, but we have a physical body that renders certain things pleasurable there. So those are pleasurable as well. But those are kind of lower pleasures. Those are, if you can have both, great. But if you can only have one or the other, go for the mental pleasures, he says. And now, why does he categorize mental pleasures as higher pleasures? Well, according to Mill, mental pleasures are those pleasures that only the people who can enjoy them are qualified to say which one is better. For instance, if you cannot enjoy both mental and physical pleasures, then you really don't have a right to say one is higher than the other. You've not tried it, so you don't know. But if you can experience both of them, then you sit in a place that enables you to be qualified to judge which one is better. So Mill believes that only the person that can experience both forms of pleasure can say which one is higher, which one is lower, and he postulates that people who can experience both higher and lower pleasures, almost everybody there who can do that, will choose higher pleasures or mental pleasures as the higher one. So that's sort of begging the question. I mean, what are you going to? Let's say you experience both of them, and you say, "No, I like physical ones better." What's he going to say? Well, he's going to say, "Well, obviously you haven't enjoyed the mental pleasures then." So it's sort of begging the question. But anyway, he believes that there is a distinction to be made between them. Now we'll talk about the trolley problem in class there, but I do want to kind of fast forward to John Mill's his classical liberalism, because this is contrasted with Karl Marx and his communism. Now, they're both the same in the sense that they do affirm an altruistic ethic. Utilitarianism, remember, is that we should always do what is in the best interest of the greatest number of people, do the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, if we follow that through consistently, then what that means is that there may be a situation where we find ourselves in the minority opinion. And if we find ourselves in the minority opinion and we realize that everybody else wants to go a different direction, rather than rebelling against them or something of that nature, what we really need to do, so long as it's not going to really engender harm to society, what we really need to do is we need to, at our own expense, at the expense of our own opinion, we need to go along with everybody else. Therefore, give up our own concern, give up our own self-interest, and just work for the greater good of all people. That's what utilitarianism says. And we will look at some issues with that in class, but that's the basic fundamental level of utilitarianism. Now, how this works out in relationship to our governance as a society, Mill says, okay, we need to apply the principle of utility, the idea that everybody should always do what is in the best interest for the greatest number of people. We need to apply that to society as a whole, and we need to govern according to that principle. Okay? Now, here's some distinctions that we need to make that are kind of nuanced, but we need to make them anyway. Remember, everybody's responding to Immanuel Kant. Karl Marx develops this dialectical materialism, and he says we need to stay below the line of despair. He doesn't use that terminology, but I'm using it for the sake of this class. We need to stay below the line of despair so that we can work in the world that we experience it. We don't know if there's anything like God out there. We don't know of the existence of any supernatural, anything spiritual, anything that gives objective value or objective purpose. All of that is above the line, and we can't get up there. Another thing, though, that is above the line that we don't experience directly is that of human rights. Human rights are a thing that is above the line. Have you ever seen a human right? Have you ever seen the right to freedom of speech? Have you ever seen the right to freedom to bear arms? The freedom of religion? Have you seen that as a right? I mean, where are we going to point to see that? And we might point to the Constitution, but at the end of the day, the Constitution is just a piece of paper with ink on it. And yes, that people have died for and bled for, and people have vowed to defend and all that sort of thing. I'm not minimalizing that. But at the end of the day, those are intangible things. Human rights are intangible things. And in a materialistic world, a phenomenal world, a world below the line of despair, is there anything that exists that's not material? Well, again, they're responding to Immanuel Kant's his bifurcation of knowledge and of value. And Mill is going to surprisingly agree with Marx in that we need to take up and we need to live in the world without trying to get above the line of despair. So he's in his political philosophy, Mill is not going he's not going to appeal to human rights at all. He's going to appeal to those things that we can experience below the line of despair. So what is his philosophy? Well, he doesn't appeal to human rights. Rather, he appeals to civil liberties. And I'm using both of those terms as technical terms at this moment. Let me define the difference. A human right is a right that is recognized, that it's a human right is a freedom that we have, it's a claim that we have on other people that includes a freedom for ourselves. That's a right that we have, and it's a moral claim. Well, Mill says, I don't know anything about a moral claim. I don't know anything about morality in general. All that I know is that I would prefer certain things to be the case, and I would prefer other things not to be the case. And if we are going to do what is in the best interest for the greatest number of people, then we are going to have a society that recognizes certain freedoms as basic and unviolable. So something that cannot be violated, right? We're going to have to recognize certain liberties, not rights, because rights is out there somewhere. But liberties are basically freedoms that are based on things that everybody believes to be in their own best interest. So for example, he would say, imagine two societies. One society is one that recognizes the freedom of speech. The other society is one where speech is heavily censored. Which society would you rather live in? Would you rather live in the United States, or would you rather live in South or North Korea? Take your pick. Mill believes and argues, and I believe probably rightly so, Mill argues the vast majority of people, we're talking almost unanimous, would rather live in a society where they have the freedom to say what they want to say. Now, that doesn't mean that people have to stick around and listen to them. People can leave anytime they want. but they would rather live in a place where they're free to say what they would say. And not only that, but if you allow people to say what they want to say, then typically that's going to head off a lot of problems later on down the road. It's going to head off a revolution, because a person can say their piece and get it out and maybe influence others and then choose a new direction for society and so forth. But it's going to head off sort of violent uprisings and violent revolutions. So Mill believes that ultimately this would be a good thing. If we lived in a society, if society extended the freedom of speech to everyone, that's the kind of society that would provide the greatest good for the greatest number. Therefore, it's justified not on the basis of human rights, it's justified based on the principle of utility. And so that's the difference. Mill does not believe in the existence of human rights. However, we have to live in a certain way below the line of despair that allows for everybody to get along in society, and he believes that the best way to do that is to recognize certain civil liberties, among which, by his count, are things like the right to believe whatever you want to, the right to express your beliefs, which would include things like freedom of speech and freedom of press, freedom of expression, and this sort of thing. So you have the right to do all of those things. You have the right to in a society that provides the greatest good for the greatest number. But he doesn't appeal to human rights. He appeals to the principle of utility in trying to keep below that line of despair and justify everything on the basis of our own human experience. So that's where he's at. In basically some prominent tenets of his his classical liberalism. I've already mentioned the rights. Basically, so here's where Mill says that the purpose of government is going to be to maximize individual liberty and minimize intrusion on the individual. So this is where he differs from Marx. You see, because Marx has everybody working for the collective, working for everybody else. That's, in that sense, very altruistic. Well, Mill is selectively altruistic. He says, look, we're going to take the course that provides the greatest good for the greatest number, but we need the kind of government that actually provides the greatest good for the greatest number is that government that maximizes freedom and minimizes government intrusion. And so basically, Mill believes that the government should the individual should be free to do whatever they want to, so long as they are not bringing harm to another person. That's his basic approach. Do anything you want to, as long as you're not harming anyone. Now, what's that going to include? Well, obviously that includes violating other people in terms of their property or their well-being or their ability to express themselves. If you're violating somebody in those ways, then the government needs to be able to step in and stop you from doing that. And so that's the prerogative of the government. The prerogative of the government is to keep individuals from harming one another. On the one hand. Now, the sort of positive thing that the government can require you to do, and this is for the good of all people, is that the government, in order to provide a safe place, has to be able to function. And so there are certain civil duties that every one of us has to follow in order to provide for a government that keeps us from harming one another. So what are those civil duties? There are things like paying your taxes. That's a civil duty that everybody has a common sort of concern with. Because if nobody's taxes get paid, then the government can't protect us from one another, and then tyranny will result. So in order to protect our liberty, the government is there. In order for the government to have the means to protect our liberty, we have to pay taxes in order to do that. So that's one of the civil duties. Another one might be jury duty. Because jury duty, the courts are absolutely necessary in order to ensure that we're all treated justly, because justice in a society provides the greatest good for the greatest number. And so a society that is just has to have a means of protecting that justice. And so we all have to serve jury duty. So that's our civic duty. If we don't do that, then people will be harmed because there will be a miscarriage of justice. Another one might be participating in the draft for the common defense, right? The draft is where if we're in a conflict with another society or another nation, sometimes there's not enough people in our military to meet the threat head on, and so we'll have to draft people into that military everybody has a common liability to do that. And if we disobey the draft, then basically we're bringing harm to everybody who we're leaving unprotected. So that would be another civil duty or civic duty. So there are civil liberties and there are civic duties. With Mill, the kind of society that provides the greatest good for the greatest number is the one that maximizes individual freedom and yet still has enough of a government to maintain a certain and ensure a certain amount of peace to keep people from harming one another. So that's Mill with his classical liberalism. But that is, again, a kind of altruism because it requires us to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. And in order for us to do that, we have to look outside of ourselves if we find ourselves in the minority, if we find ourselves not in part of the greatest number. So that brings us to basically the winding down of the Enlightenment. And where we're going to kind of jump off from here is we're going to get into what is known as the modern era. In fact, some of our thinkers really kind of transition into that anyway. But we're going to look at some in the modern era in the next video. Thank you very much. We'll see you then.